Amasa Lyman was born 200 years ago, 1813, early in the year, and was reared in Connecticut. Not a very happy childhood, partly because his father went off to work when he was 3 and never returned. Didn't write very much, probably was helping maybe on the Erie Canal, that's not sure. But apparently then went on to New Orleans, where apparently he was murdered.
Well, Amasa Mason Lyman is a very interesting study in early Mormon history. He covers a pretty broad spectrum of the 19th century. And he's an early convert, not the earliest. He comes in 1832, and certainly by that time the church has a considerable number of members, but he's there early on. He's an early player.
He lost his father very young, and his mother put him with his grandfather, Perez Mason.
2 Mormon missionaries, Orson Pratt and Lyman Johnson, come into the area, and Uncle Parley prohibits Amasa from talking with them. But he meets them out in the forest or along the side of the road and quickly gains a testimony and is secretly baptized. And when Parley hears about that, Amasa is basically banished.
Amasa was a very strict leader. He was an apostle by this time. He was as faithful as most anybody could be, being obedient to counsel, doing what was difficult, where he was going, where he was assigned, doing what he was asked.
Palmyra is where the Book of Mormon was published, and the Mormons sort of left Palmyra in 1831 and went to Kirtland and Independence. And they didn't go back for almost 100 years. I began to think about the importance of the Book of Mormon and its appeal in Western New York. Now, we know from Whitney Cross, and we know from a lot of other people who have looked at the period that Whitney Cross wrote about as the burned over district, as the district where there were so many enthusiasms, religious enthusiasms, and some people just call it so many revivals, but I think it's more enthusiasms of various kinds, that he called it the burned over district, as if these religions went through and burned it over, and it would be sort of the end of interest in religion.
One of the significant names in the Exodus has to be that of Apostle Amasa Lyman, who is brought into the Quorum of the 12 in Nauvoo and begins to exercise a great influence for good in the Exodus story of the church. You begin to see this particularly in the discussions over the leadership of the church and who's to follow Joseph Smith. Amasa Lyman gives a classic discourse on who to follow as to the leadership of the church.
One thing we know is that at a certain point in 1842, when Joseph had found a vacancy in the Quorum of the 12, he called Amasa to that position, ordained him an apostle. So that shows some degree of confidence. He'd been very faithful, gone on innumerable missions, and why not? He's eloquent, speaks well, and though he's unlearned, he still had a lot of influence. So Joseph called him. But it was one of those callings that was sort of like the bride left at the altar. It never quite worked out the way you thought it would. He was called when Orson Pratt was going through a very difficult time, and it looked like he might leave the church, leaving a vacancy in the Quorum of the 12. And Amasa was called and ordained at that moment. But then Orson Pratt, good-hearted man that he was, saw the error of his ways and came back. And so Amasa's place was occupied, and he became the 13th apostle, as Brigham Young later called him. And Joseph didn't quite know what to do with it, and he suggested to the brethren, well, maybe I'll put him in the first presidency to give him place. But that never quite worked out either. He sort of was on the verge of being in the first presidency when Joseph got impatient with Sidney Rigdon.
On October 1st, 1843, Joseph anointed two brethren, William Law and Amasa Lyman, as his counselors in the presidency of the Quorum of the Anointed, which was the group that was going to supervise implementation of the Nauvoo Temple, which had a much more complex temple ceremony than Kirtland, more like the temple is now. This is when most of that is instituted.
In the meantime, Brigham Young says to Charles C. Rich, the Apostle Charles C. Rich, I want you to go to California and help Amasa Lyman. Amasa had been in California already. He had left earlier in the spring of 49. And so he's over there managing the affairs of the Latter-day Saints in California. There's a lot of them. And I think, in my own personal opinion, you have this huge wave of immigration coming through, and Brigham says to himself, Amasa can't handle, the temporal and spiritual affairs of Latter-day Saints in California on his own. He's going to need some assistance. So he calls Rich to go and help Amasa Lyman administer sort of the mission of Western California, I think is the way they describe it. There's about 35 guys total, I think, who are in this group that are going to go with Rich to California to assist Lyman.
Amasa Lyman is put in charge of what we call, I guess the sources really say he was in charge of a Mormon spy company. This spy company was maybe not what most people think. All it was basically intended to do was be a kind of a reconnaissance company to see if anyone was going to come through and come into Caldwell County and cause problems. And so Amasa and about 10 men kind of patrol this area of southern Ray County, or southern Caldwell County and northern Ray County, to just kind of be on the lookout for enemies who may be trying to come to Far West or come into Caldwell County and cause problems.
I think it's a tragedy that he and many others who gave great service in the church are left out of church history simply because of one act or a series of acts, when their whole lives should be considered as part of the great history of this kingdom in the latter days.